Bell. And today we are honored and privileged to have with us Dr. Einat Wilf, former Knesset member. She is a very impressive intellectual with a very interesting voice in the Israeli public sphere. It is as if she made a point to go to she went to a country, she said, what's the best school here? I'll go there. So she did her undergraduate degree in Harvard. She did her MBA, if I'm not mistaken, in SEED, which is a prestigious place in France, and her PhD in Cambridge. And I'm just, Hebrew University, so maybe, I'm a little bit out of my league here. But as I said, she's an impressive individual in many aspects, and we're very joyous and privileged to have her speak with us today. She wrote several books, I think 6 by now. If I'm missing, I will stand corrected. And her late book, which we'll discuss today, but I hope to get to other subjects as well, is about the war of return, related to the right of return, and how, I can see the book already. Thank you, Carol. Very good. And we'll discuss some issues a little bit. So, Dr. Wilf, would you care to introduce yourself? I think your personal story is also of great effect in regards to the subject as well. So, please.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you for having me. And
I'll just open your microphone, and everybody else is muted. Yeah, we should be able to hear you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Should I start now?
No. You said good evening. We heard that. I just wanted to mute everybody else. Go ahead.
Got it. Okay. And thank you especially to those who are already reading the book. So this is exciting. I want to give you a bit of a background on how I even came to be interested in the topic. By now, I've devoted at least a decade to it. And what is really the background that led me to write the book? So I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem. The background, the social background where I grew up was a neighborhood called Beit HaKerem, very much kind of classic Israeli Labor Party. Everyone that I knew in the neighborhood.
My brother teaches at Tichon Beit HaKerem, right?
Yes.
You went there? Gimnasia Rechavia or Leyada?
Yes.
Yeah.
So everywhere where I lived, everyone voted for Ma'arach, for the Labor Party. And as a young adult into the 80s and 90s, I developed the politics, or I adopted the politics of the Labor Party, which especially during the 80s and 90s became associated with a very simple idea. The idea was that Israel has a path to peace, and the peace is based on a very simple formula, which was known as land for peace. And the beauty of the land for peace formula was really its simplicity. It had this elegance of simplicity that was a great vision. I mean, all that Israel had to do in order to get peace that eluded it since its foundation, was to hand over land. Which land? The land that it acquired as a result of the 6-Day War, the Sinai Peninsula in the south, the Golan Heights in the north, and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in the center. If Israel were to hand over this land, the expectation was that it would get peace with its Arab neighbors. And for a while, this formula seemed to work beautifully, especially, of course, in the peace agreement with Egypt, where Israel handed over the entire Sinai Peninsula, twice the size of Israel, and in return got a peace agreement with Egypt. Now, we can have an interesting discussion whether what we have with Egypt today should properly be called peace, but at the time, this was viewed as a realization of the land for peace formula. Now, the 1990s were basically dominated by the land for peace formula. We were negotiating with the Syrians over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan agreed to hand over, or basically to forgo, its territorial demands in the West Bank. And of course, the highlight of the 90s were the Oslo Accords and the negotiations with the PLO over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. So the feeling at the time, and this was, I'm sure you'll remember, the general feeling of the 1990s, this euphoria of the end of history, the Soviet Union collapse, apartheid in South Africa came to an end, Northern Ireland signed a peace agreement. So the feeling was that this is really the end of history. And of course, it had its impact here with respect to our conflict and the feeling that we're going to be closing the conflict and making peace based on the Land for Peace formula. So the head of the Israeli peace camp, Ehud Barak, ending the 1990s, goes in the year 2000 to Camp David. Now, Camp David is symbolic. This is where peace with Egypt was negotiated. And Ehud Barak goes to Camp David and he puts on the table a proposal, a bold proposal. Some people now say reckless, but at the time it was bold. And basically it gave the Palestinians everything we were told they wanted: a fully sovereign, independent state in the West Bank and Gaza. No settlements in sight. The settlements were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So settlements were going to be out of the issue. An end to the occupation. So a Palestinian state, the Israeli military will be gone. A state, the territory of the West Bank and Gaza. So it was a state, and the capital was going to be in East Jerusalem, including holy sites in the Old City. So this was a check mark on everything we were told that the Palestinians wanted. End of the occupation, no settlements, a Palestinian state, freedom, dignity, East Jerusalem. Everything was on the table. All they had to do was say yes. And they walk away. Arafat walks away. President Clinton puts this proposal into a set of parameters, and Arafat rejects them. This repeats itself in 2008. Abu Mazen walks from a similar proposal from Ehud Olmert, even better in some aspects, but the same principles, walks away. And in the year 2001, 2, 3, 4, what followed the Israeli proposal for peace, the Land for Peace, was not just a Palestinian rejection. What followed was a campaign of brutal massacres in our streets. People were being blown to bits by suicide bombers in buses, in cafes, in hotels, in Israel. Not territories, not settlements, nothing controversial, supposedly. And Israelis like myself, Israelis of the peace camp, began to ask, what do the Palestinians want? What's their story? They could have had a state twice, in 2000 and 2008. Why are they repeatedly walking away from that? And especially, why do they follow it with a campaign of violence inside Israel? What is it that they're hoping to achieve? And I began to be interested in that. I met with Palestinians. I began to research. This is when I met my co-writer, Adi Schwartz. And we realized that it was hiding in plain sight. That it was staring us in the face all along. What the Palestinians wanted was exactly what they said they wanted: Palestine from the river to the sea. They were opposed, as they had been from 1917 on, to the idea of a sovereign state for the Jewish people in any part of the land. And in particular, at this moment in history, this desire was encapsulated in what they called a right of return. The idea that millions of Palestinians possess a right that supersedes Israeli sovereignty to settle inside the state of Israel, and the numbers being what they are, the implications are that an exercise of this so-called right of return would mean that the state of Israel would become an Arab state, a Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. What Adi and I realized is that throughout the negotiations, when Palestinians said that they supported two states, but continued to insist that the right of return is sacred, as they do, then the only two states they ever envisioned at the end of the peace process was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Palestinian state to replace the state of Israel. We realized that there was never a moment, not a single moment, when a Palestinian leader accepted a peace vision in which Israel would stay as is. So whether the formula was an armed struggle of Palestine from the river to the sea, or two states with return, or the currently fashionable one state, the notion was always the same. Nowhere between the river and the sea should the Jewish people enjoy political rights as a sovereign nation. So this encapsulates the book. And I'll just say to end, I mean, we started the book with a simple research question. How is it that from a war that ended more than 7 decades ago, we have today millions of people who were born after the war, who were never displaced by the war, who claim to be refugees from that war, millions of people. And in a way that is unparalleled and unprecedented with any other conflict in the 20th century, in the 1940s and 50s. And we came up with a very simple answer at the end. The answer to how can we have millions of refugees from a war that ended more than 7 decades ago is that from the Palestinian perspective, the war never ended. As far as they're concerned, the war of 1948 has not ended. It remains open. And if it remains open, it means that they don't have to admit defeat. They don't have to accept its outcomes. And it means that in their mind, they can still win that war one day and have their Palestine from the river to the sea. So let me stop here with those introductory comments.
Right. The introductory indeed leads to, several following questions. I want to start with something that is specifically relevant for today, or to be more exact, relevant for today and yesterday. So today is Memorial Day in the US, and yesterday was exactly 20 years to Israel leaving South Lebanon. You've mentioned that the Second Intifada, which ensued the proposal of Ehud Barak in Camp David, you made a link between the two. Many have made a linkage between Israel leaving Lebanon, especially in the way it did it, and the Second Intifada as well. I think Yossi Beilin, who you were assisting back in the days, right, and Shimon as well, actually said it, that Arafat came to him and said, listen, you cannot do that to me, because by leaving Lebanon, what you're doing is you're proving that the only thing that Israelis understand is blood. And so, that was that is Yossi Beilin's explanation of how we, leaving Lebanon, in a sense, though he supported and still supports it, led to the Second Intifada. What do you think about the linkage between living Lebanon and the Second Intifada? The reason Memorial Day is U.S. Memorial Day, though, and today is relevant to the question, is that I myself lost my brother in Lebanon in that period of 18 years between 1982 and 2000, when we were in Lebanon, and the Israeli public, or at least a major part of it, makes a linkage between the two. Do you see that as irrelevant? I know it a little bit segues from our discussion, but what do you think about that linkage between the two?
So actually, there's quite a few links, and I'm sorry to hear about your brother. It was a terrible.
You didn't do it. It was the Hezbollah.
No,
don't worry. No.
Sorry to hear about it.
Yeah.
It's there are several linkages here. one of the things that we describe in the book is, in general, the whole formation of the Palestinian national ethos and identity around the idea that they are refugees from the War of 1948. And as you know, many of the refugees went to Lebanon and were established there in refugee camps. And Lebanon, of all the Arab countries, treated the Arab refugees the worst. And one of the things that we detail in the book is the manner in which the Palestinian identity was formed in the Palestinian refugee camps, to the point that it was also centered around the idea of revenge and return. And one of the arguments that Dee and I make is that it's no coincidence that Israel's bloodiest wars were fought on the border with Lebanon and on the borders with Gaza, where the refugee camps are the most dominant and the refugee culture is the most prominent. So first of all, I think there's a direct long-term link between our wars in Lebanon. I mean, we entered Lebanon in 1982, not because of Hezbollah. We entered because of Palestinian terrorism. Our wars in Gaza are because of Palestinian terrorism. And what we detail in the book is how Palestinian terrorism is a direct outgrowth of the culture and the refugee camps that called for revenge and return. Now, it's true that whenever Israel appears weak, so it could be the way we leave Lebanon, or if it's
the famous spider web speech by Nasrallah.
Right. So because the goal remains constant, the goal, I mean, in that sense, Arafat is giving an excuse. Because the goal of liberating Palestine, I mean, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, is established in 1964. In 1964, Israel does not control the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Jordan and Egypt do. So which Palestine does the PLO want to liberate? Well, of course, the Palestine that is the state of Israel. So the goal is permanent, Palestine from the river to the sea. That's what I said about that, the fact that it stared us in the face, that it was there all along. The goal was constant. Whenever Israel appears weak, it creates a greater motivation to pursue that goal by violence. So we see throughout the decades various efforts to pursue the goal. Before 1947, it's through violence and political lobbying to close the land to Jewish immigration. Since 1947, it's by wars. Between 48 and 73, it's by invasion of Arab armies. After 73 in particular, it's terrorism and economic boycotts. At the moment, it's a lot about return and kind of a war of legal warfare, political warfare, but the goal remains the same: to undo Jewish sovereign presence in the land. And in that sense, when Arafat said, the fact that you left Lebanon makes it harder for me to make peace with you, that makes exactly zero difference. The reason that it's difficult to make peace with Israel for the Palestinian perspective is that they don't want to make peace with Israel. They want Palestine from the river to the sea. They think it is justice to get Palestine from the river to the sea. They think it is the things that they are owed. They believe they have a right of return, even though they don't. It's not enshrined in law. The international system does not accept that a people can have a right that supersedes the sovereignty of another nation. But in their mind, this is theirs, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get it. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to give it up unless they figure out that they have no choice.
Right. In that regards, you said, and I agree, that the words of Arafat did not mean much. I want to ask you along this line. He was shouting out of rooftops, "Haqq al-Auda, Haqq al-Auda, Haqq al-Auda," to anyone who would hear it. That is, right of return, right of return, right of return. In 1994, in his Johannesburg speech that was recorded without him knowing, all of a sudden, everybody knows that it's a charade. Everybody, how were people so blindly following a line, of such uh, a reckless endangerment of our land, and how did it happen that so many people continued with this? From a personal standpoint, when was the moment for you that you said to yourself, just a second, they're saying it all along, they say from the river to the sea, they say Haqq al-Auda, right of return. Yes, I should, yeah, they do mean what they say. What was the moment for you and for the majority of Israeli public, I think, because today I think our listeners should understand that the Israeli left of this, maybe if I may say, naive, optimistic view of simplistic land for peace, is represented by maybe 5% of parliament members, and I'm even exaggerating by that. So maybe 3%, depends who you count, But how did it happen, and when was the moment for you and for many Israelis to realize and to take Palestinian positions at the word?
So it was a combination. First of all, again, it's important to bring back the spirit of the 90s. Israel is not an island. So whatever is the global spirit affects Israel. And the 1990s, there was really a sense of the end of history. All of the things that appeared impossible suddenly happened within a very short period of time. The Soviet Union, the evil empire, collapses overnight. This seemed impossible. Eastern Europe is now free. Peace in Northern Ireland, how long was that an intractable conflict? Apartheid in South Africa is coming to an end. So there was really this global spirit that swept the world and us within it of the end of history.
Like Francis Fukuyama, famous.
Exactly. But it really reflected people's sense. I mean, when you live through that, it makes sense to you. It's very easy for us to now, in retrospect, say, how was everybody so blind? But when so many unbelievable events happen in such a short period of time, then it's very reasonable to believe that this could happen. The other thing is, throughout the 90s and even before, the expectation was that, yes, the Palestinians are speaking of return, but it's a bargaining chip. Now, this was a legitimate worldview in the 1990s because Israel had not yet really put on the table before that a full proposal to the Palestinians to control the West Bank and Gaza. So until Ehud Barak does that, both sides of the Israeli political map are speculating. One side says land for peace, and they're supported by the Egyptian example and the general spirit of the 1990s. Another side says all of Israel, don't trust the ours, but they haven't tried it. So the right has nothing to say when the left tells it, but have you tried? Have you made a proposal? Only once Ehud Barak puts a proposal on the table and Clinton backs it up with his parameters, can we actually check the assumptions of both sides. So for me, the difference is once you have actual experience. Up until that moment, it's all speculation on both sides. But once Ehud Barak puts a proposal on the table, the thesis that the right of return is a bargaining chip, that's the moment to examine it. And we tell in the books about the negotiating moment where the people in the negotiating room begin to say, the Palestinians are serious about the right of return. And what the negotiators realized, and ultimately the Israeli public realized, is that this was not a bargaining chip. In fact, when the Palestinians were faced with the choice, you can have your own state in part of the land, only in West Bank and Gaza, but it means that you will sign an agreement that says that end of claims, there's no right of return, that's it, Israel remains as is. They preferred to bargain away the state in order to keep fighting for the right of return and to not sign an agreement that says that it's over. So what I'm saying is, throughout the 90s, it's a legitimate worldview to say it's a bargaining chip because we didn't put the theory to the test. But once we put it to a real genuine test, and not just once, twice, with Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, and twice the Palestinians walk away, and the violence that follows, this is the moment that you judge them by their actions, and you bring their words and their actions together, and you say, okay, even when faced with the opportunity for a state, return is to them more important than statehood. Now, you're right that this experience basically led to the disappearance of the Israeli left. Today, in the Israeli political map, I agree it's even less. There are basically 3 seats at
You can
most.
count maybe Ofer Kasif, though. There are
Yeah,
3 seats for Meretz, 1 of Merav Michaeli,
exactly.
yeah,
That's
and then
about,
Ofer Kasif.
yeah,
So I gave them
that's
the
about,
5%, even though it might
exactly.
range
You're
between 3 and
generous.
5%. So I
Yeah.
was like generous.
Yeah, that's about the number of people who think that the reason we don't have peace is that Israel didn't try hard enough, or that Israel didn't offer enough. But it's important to emphasize also that because of all that happened, the Israeli right has also disappeared. In the right in the sense that we want all of the country and every square inch where the Bible mentions we have to own it. That also barely has 5%, and even they are now in the opposition. The vast majority of the Israeli public today, from Likud to Labor, is what I call a massive centrist blob that basically says, we don't really want to control the Palestinians, but we also haven't figured out how to not do that in a way that is safe and secures peace.
By
So
the
we're
way, I think
stuck.
that even Naftali Bennett's program is only talking about Area C. So even though,
Exactly.
I don't think that today there is anyone in the coalition, and really I have hard time to remember anyone since the 90s who were a Knesset member who was adamant on recapturing Palestinian cities and taking responsibility for their like sanitation and sewage and stuff like that. It's really non-existent in the Israeli discourse.
Yeah. So both ends of, the fierce debates of the 80s, of 90s, land for peace or greater Israel, which defined a massive political divide in Israel, have essentially disappeared. And they disappeared not because anyone made a better argument, they disappeared in the face of experience and reality.
Right. In the subtitle of your book, you're talking about the West, okay?
Yes.
And we are the West here, basically. We are from all around the world here. And you say that the West is indulging in the Palestinian dream of or claim of hakal of right of return, and that is actually motivating the continuation of the conflict and providing it burning wood, so to speak. And specifically, could you exemplify and mention also what you have said and about UNRWA, which we have mentioned here in this forum in the past, but you can definitely elaborate on that. So if you will, please.
So one of the things that we detail in the book is how exceptional is the Western attitude towards the Palestinian refugees, the Arab refugees from the war. And we show it in the context of all other conflicts of the era. And as you know, the 20th century was a very bloody century. We begin the 20th century when the world is divided between empires. We end the 20th century when the world is divided between nation states. And this entire transition between empires to nation states is bloody. And it involves 2 world wars and numerous colonial wars and civil wars. And in this process, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people become refugees. They are displaced, they are expelled. Hindus and Muslims across India and Pakistan, Germans, Ukrainians, Poles across all of Europe, people all across Africa, Koreans. I mean, this is the 20th century. Are any of them refugees today? No. And the reason was that the general kind of policy towards refugees throughout the 20th century was tough. It's tragic. You lost your homes. Many have lost their lives. It's sad, but move on. You're not going back. Whatever territory you had, it's over. Now it's India, now it's Pakistan, now it's South Korea, now it's Germany, now it's Poland, now it's Ukraine. It's over. So maybe your family lived for centuries in Eastern Germany, and now it's Western Poland, and you've been brutally expelled, but you're not going back. And the message to hundreds of millions of refugees is move on. And the Palestinians are the only ones who don't receive that message. And not only do they not get that message, they receive the opposite message. An agency is established for them called UNRWA. Now, that in itself is not special. We tell the story of another agency called UNCRA, which was established for Korea after the war in Korea, which is about the same time. Now, UNCRA is a temporary agency, and so is UNRWA. Why? Because the assumption is they're going to spend a few years resettling the refugees, and they're going to close down. And that's what UNCRA does. UNCRA resettles 2 million, if not more, Korean refugees. None of them go back to their former homes in North Korea. They build new lives. There's no right of return, and UNCRA closes. Now look at South Korea today. What a great country. Imagine that all the Koreans would be sitting still in refugee camps and demanding a right of return. South Korea would be a wasteland. But the Palestinians were given an exception. UNRWA just tweeted in the last few weeks that it's proud to celebrate 70 years. Now it's ridiculous because you don't celebrate 70 years of a temporary agency which was supposed to close down 4 years after it was established. Now, the reason that UNRWA kept being renewed is that in the 1950s, the Arab world is powerful. It's united. The Arab League is powerful. Oil is important. The Western world needs oil. There's a fear of a Soviet takeover of the Arab world. So, especially under Eisenhower, the West caves into Arab pressure. And because the Arabs say, look, 1948, the war is not over. This is the reason, by the way, that they signed a ceasefire agreement with Israel in 1949. They didn't sign a peace agreement.
Right, an armistice, right.
Yeah, it was an armistice because this was a ceasefire in an ongoing war, which actually had a second phase in 1967, which was even worse for them. But basically, they say the war is open and they refuse to settle the refugees. The refugees themselves refuse to settle because the war is still open and they want to win back the land. So the Arab countries and the refugees basically threaten the West to not close down UNRWA. America wants to close down UNRWA, it sees that UNRWA is useless, no one's being settled, it wants to close it down. But the Arab countries basically threaten the West to continue funding UNRWA. And we describe it from that moment on as a kind of a bribe. Basically, Eisenhower and the West say to themselves, you know what? We'll give $100 million a year. By the last few years, it became $400 million a year. But that's peanuts in order to keep the Arab world away from the Soviet orbit, to keep oil flowing. But what we're saying is that this is no longer the situation. The Arab world is not united. The Arab League is a shadow of its former self. The Soviet Union is gone. And the Arab world, parts of it, no longer hate Israel as they used to and no longer want to keep the War of 1948 open. So we think the time has come, and in that sense, we think the book is timely, not just as a history book, but as a policy book to say, look, you've kept this racket, you paid the bribe to the mob for about 70 years. You don't need to do that anymore. This is, by the way, what President Trump instinctively understood, that he can stop paying UNRWA and there will be no repercussions. And he was right. And this is what we're saying to other Western countries to do. Stop funding UNRWA, stop fueling the conflict. You don't need to do this anymore. The Arab world is in a different place, which means that the Palestinians can finally get the same message that all other refugees in the world got, which is the war is over, it's sad, it's tragic, but move on with your lives.
Right. It's very interesting, and you made, you had a very interesting historical perspective of the events, and you've even emphasized the zeitgeist of the 90s in its contribution to the blind spot of Israeli public opinion. What would you think would be the current zeitgeist which might lead to a current blind spot in Israeli public opinion? I know it's a difficult question, yeah, but
I'm not sure. I'm not. You're asking me for a new blind spot, or
yeah, a current. Like you said, listen, the 90s were the time of the end of history. The world was changing rapidly, so it led us to a kind of a blind spot in our understanding of the situation. I'm saying, what is the current zeitgeist? If it's kind of getting out of the world and trying to look at it from outside. And as an intellectual, I'm saying maybe you have a point here to that you can look and say, listen, this might be a blind spot we have because of the current zeitgeist. Let me kind of maybe work with you to make a point here. You have a special gift that many of the other speakers about Israel don't have. You come from the liberal side of the political map, and you understand progressive thinking. You talk about Israel being first of all, you talk about feminism, and you talk about the place of Israel and how progressive values should support Israel and so forth. I think that the latest, again, I might not be all caught up on the trends, but it was, I think, Aryeh Dubnov and Laura Robson who published a work titled Transnational Period, or when their main theses, Transnational History of the 20th Century, Territorial Separation. That's the name of the book. And their very interesting claim, again, it's kind of a super like postmoderna. They claim that the founding of national states is actually a continuation of imperialism and not a fight against it, and thus the establishment of the state of Israel is not a fight against imperialism, but rather continuation of imperialism in different means. What's your take on it? Because I heard, a conversation, and I was exposed to the book. Intuitively, I said, "What a load!" But it's an interesting kind of a postmodern claim.
Um, Look, first of all, I tend to be very suspicious of anyone who makes grand claims and then somehow the outcome is there should be no Israel. You know,
Right.
sometimes, especially when I meet young people, often they genuinely say things like, but everything you're describing about Israel and the Jewish people and the right to self-determination and a nation state, it's so 19th century, it's so passe, why do you still need that? And, after a while, I just began to give this answer. I would say, look, you know what? I want to live in a John Lennon world too. No religion, no borders, all of humanity living as one. It's just that when you ask
Don't
the
get me
Jewish,
starting to sing here
yeah,
because everybody would suffer. Right. Right.
but I say, but when you ask the Jewish people to take the first step, I get very suspicious. So it's always this notion of people have grand visions for a unified world, and somehow it's Israel that's the problem. So I always joke and I say, you know what, we'll play ball. There's 200 nation states in the world. You say this is continued imperialism, fine. When 100 nation states fling open their borders, announce that borders don't matter anymore, languages don't matter anymore, histories don't matter, that there's not going to be any special signs, no flags, nothing. When that happens to 100 nation states in the world, you know what? The Jews will also give up their nation state. But somehow the notion that we are the problem is one that I am very suspicious of, because of course it reflects a very old, ancient idea that the Jews are what stands between the world, and especially, of course, the Christian West, and utopia.
The
So
Jew among, the Jewish state is the Jew among the state, kind of a
yeah,
claim.
and especially the notion that the Jew stands between the present and salvation, between the present and utopia. So I'm very suspicious, of course, of such arguments. So
Obviously,
if
by the way, both of them I think are Jewish. Aryeh
oh,
Dubunov is, yeah, but that's beside the
that,
point.
that's actually typical, if
Right.
anything.
Yeah, quite typical. I want to ask you a completely different question that is, it might not be relevant. I think it is relevant. You have dealt with education, and what we're doing here is education. So I will ask you about, you wrote a book with your mother about education. And I am a parent of 6 kids in Israel. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, listen, for men, it's, I'm not saying it easy. I'm a stay-home dad. So I can tell
Okay.
you, I try to do my best and to take my fair share. But I want to ask you, you have suggested, you know what, maybe I want to preface it with something. So a thought experiment, which I do with my friends oftentimes, I ask them, guys, if you take the education budget of Israel and you divide it by the number of students in the Israeli education system, how much would each student cost, okay, a month? And how much do you pay? Because education, like public education, starts at the age of 3 in Israel. So if you have a child under the age of 3, you send him to a private kindergarten. Basically, there are some subsidies, yeah. But how much do you pay your private kindergarten? And what do you get out of the private kindergarten versus the state? So I give them the data, and they are amazed to learn that the state pays per student an average that is higher, let's say by at least 20-30%, depends how much they pay, higher than what they pay the private kindergarten. The private kindergarten has like 5 kids or 6 kids per person per like teacher, okay, or caretaker. They start at 7 or 8 and they end only in 4 or 5. You get breakfast, you get lunch, you get only 1 month of overall vacation. Let's say a week in Sukkot in the festival of booths, a week in the festival of Passover, and then 2 weeks in the summer. And when I compare it with a public educational system, which has about, I would say, 3.5 months of vacation. It starts at 8, it ends at 1:30, 2. You don't get lunch, you don't get breakfast. You get one teacher in a room of 30 kids. Let's say, I'm trying to be as generous as I can for both sides, and I show them the difference between the two. One of the points of your suggestion is improving the educational system with not putting more money into it. So how would you go about doing that?
So that really takes us to another topic, and I'm happy
Completely.
to do a longer one some other time. But
Sure.
just to be short, first of all, I've had a very different experience. When I tried to put my children in private kindergartens, I was horrified both by the quality, and I took them out immediately. And then I was very
You
lucky.
probably have higher standards than me. That's
No,
the
no.
difference.
And then I put them in Vitso, and I was thrilled. So
Oh,
the professionalism, the quality, and this is basically state subsidized. So,
but it's private. It's state. It's
yeah,
not
but
state owned. Veto. I said there are some subsidies.
yeah,
It is.
but
Yeah.
anyway, but I am a staunch defender of public education. When you go throughout the world, by and large, the countries that do better as a country, I'm not talking about an individual parent, as a country are countries with public education system. And the reason is that education by and large is not serial. It's not the kind of good that is easily quantifiable and compared. It's much harder to define what ultimately leads and creates a good education. And there are important elements to a countrywide public education system. So you can do public education badly, but you can do it well. And you can, in general, and of course, private education, you have a wide variety. But I think, especially for a country like Israel, that still has an ethos of fighting, of solidarity, it is immensely important to keep a public education system and to fight for it. As the head of the education committee, I fought against various privatization efforts, and I'm proud that I was able to block many of them, because education does not respond well to competitive pressures. It actually corrupts the process of education. Again, it's not serial. It's not the kind of thing that you can easily compare. Sometimes it takes you 20 years later to realize that something was a good education. It's very difficult to assess education in real time. So a lot of these things yield the fact that competition is basically terrible for two types of areas: healthcare and education. Those are the two areas that benefit the most from being public. And you can have some measures, but by and large, healthcare and education are best served when they are public.
Okay.
My various proposals were how to do it better, but it was always under the presumption that it needs to be kept public and it can be done better.
Right. I don't think there is any current voice, except maybe not really in Israeli public sphere, that says to completely get rid of public education. Not even the most right wing. Maybe Moshe. There is the voucher suggestion.
I fought many of those voices, and with a lot of data and a lot of comparisons. And I take some credit for the fact that those voices were not able. There was a moment when they were on the rise, and I take some credit for the fact that, like you say, they're not very prominent today.
They're not very prominent, in the sense of annulling the public system. There are some calls for voucher system, or at least trying a voucher system, or trying to let privatization. On a personal note, when my parents founded the school which I attended, it was my older sister, who was their fourth kid, and they started a private school, which later on became an official, non-official recognized institution, what's known as Mukar She'eno Rishmi, yeah. And they were actually the police started investigating them for not, like, starting an investigation for not sending your kids to school because of the compulsory education bill that we have in Israel. A very important question by Simon. Simon is asking, what do you think about the application of Israeli law to parts of the sea areas that is suggested as the deal of the century, as part of this? What's your take on it?
Look, in truth, I think too much is made of it for the simple reason that it's easily reversible. But I sometimes say that a lot depends the way that people view annexation, call it application of Israeli law, which I think is worse. But it depends how people think of Jerusalem. If people think of Jerusalem as a success, they're likely to support it. I grew up in Jerusalem. I saw the disaster that was the annexation of the 28 Arab villages after 1967 to create the monstrosity that was called United Jerusalem, which was never united. It's still not united. I never went to the eastern part. Nobody I knew ever went to the eastern part.
Well, you went to the Kotel, I'm sure, That's
only once in school. That's it. And I mean, it is a disaster. I lived through the process of Jerusalem becoming a poor, dirty city as a result of, and all in the name of keeping up this idea of a united Jerusalem. I mean, it would have been one thing if Israel annexed the 6 square kilometers of, the old city and around it, but it had to annex.
Basin.
Yeah, it had to annex 70 square kilometers, including 28 Arab villages, and declare them United Jerusalem, to which the Jewish people have always longed. I mean, it's beyond ridiculous. And it made Jerusalem a poor, dirty, in my view, a terrible city where all its productive, or many of its productive forces, basically fled. So I definitely don't want that for Israel. It's one thing if people flee from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, they still remain in Israel. But if Israel is going to succumb to this notion of let's annex and ultimately enmesh ourselves with the Palestinian population.
No, I think it's not a question of population here, as the areas that are up for annexation, at least at this point, are not areas with a lot of Palestinian population.
So if the story is some parts of the Jordan Valley, some settlements that are next to the 1949 ceasefire lines, and that's the end of it. I mean, Israel declares that as far as it's concerned, this is its final eastern border. No more settlements, no more enmeshment inside the West Bank. I mean, if Israel declares that this is the end of it, then I would be for it. I would be even very much for it. But that's at least the scenario under which someone like me would support it. Otherwise, all I see in my mind is a slow slide towards the nightmare that united Jerusalem has become.
Okay, and last question. We've got a few more minutes. Last question, Jerry. How can we get a lecture without your question?
Yeah. Well, it was very, very enjoyable. I'm going to get your book. I always like to meet the author of the book that I get. I
You're
was
not the
able
only
to
one.
get.
Some have already gotten it. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I met the author of the book of my life, and that was a wonderful book.
Wow.
And I was able to meet Moshe Dayan back in the day after the Entebbe War. But my question to you is that what you described to me was a paradigm shift from land for peace. And so now we're in this area of limbo. So how do we then be able to live in peace if there is no land for peace?
So you're right that we are indeed, we're stuck. The land for peace has been completely devastated. Not completely in the sense that we're out of the Sinai, we're out of Gaza, we're not going back there. Like you said, 40, 50, 60% of the West Bank, we don't want that. We're out of Lebanon. The Golan Heights is part of it. So I think since 1977, you can chart a long-term process by which Israel is slowly establishing its final borders. So I think that's the process we're in. And to chart a kind of optimistic aspect to it, we're actually in the last leg. Our southern border is complete. Our northern border is complete. Much of our eastern border is complete. And what we're left with is the question of the West Bank. Now, it's still a major question, but imagine where we were a few decades ago and where we are now. So I think we're slowly closing in on the last mile or quite a few miles of Israel's final eastern border. And I think there's a general consensus that to the Jordan River, there will be only one military, the Israeli Defense Forces, that the Palestinians will broadly control their lives. And then there's a negotiation of how much more can they control their lives without risking ours. But again, that's a very different negotiation. It's much more nuanced than land for peace. It's much more graded. And you're already seeing Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, that are beginning to accept that this is where we're heading and are preparing themselves towards normalizing relationships with Israel based on this idea. So I think this is where we're heading slowly. And it's no longer this kind of grand theme. I mean, Land for Peace really had this elegance of simplicity. Now it's much more mucky, the process. But I think the reason that it's more mucky is because we're really at the last leg of it. This is the final frontier, the final border that is yet to be determined. And we're already, the negotiations have already become much more limited to, are we going to annex 20% or 60%? But no one, as you said, says above 60. And will it be a fully sovereign Palestinian state or more of an autonomy? But this is a much different negotiation than the one that we had in the 90s. And it seems that we're heading in that direction.
Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilf. It was an absolute pleasure. And we have learned so much. And I not just learned, I think your perspective of zooming out and looking at things, looking at just a second, it's not just this subject, but look, the borders have shaped themselves mostly, and we just have that point, or your ability to zoom out and look at things from a historical perspective was an absolute joy for us, for me personally, and I'm sure for everybody. While the subject of education is, I think, was not exhausted yet, but it has been a pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate you coming, and I'm sure everybody does as well. So we thank you very much. Oh, guys, can you hear me?
Thank
Yes.
you.
Now.
Yeah, we've lost you for a while.
Yes,
Thank you.
exactly.
Thank
But
you.
thank you.
I didn't
Thank
say
you very
anything
much.
important.
Appreciate
Bye-bye.
it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
you.
Very good. Come back.